The desert planet called Kepler 442b held secrets that nobody expected, and the massive circular structure buried in the sand had drawn scientists from 17 different alien species across the galaxy for 3 long years, and they all wanted to understand what it was and how it worked, but nothing they tried seemed to make any difference at all. Commander Jacob Harris stood at the edge of the deep pit, watching another group of aliens attempt to activate the ancient gate. And these particular aliens were called Vorhalans, and their bodies were made of living crystal that caught the orange sunlight and scattered it into rainbow patterns across the excavation site. But even with all their advanced technology, they could not make the gate respond to anything they did. Lieutenant Kate Morgan walked up beside him holding a datapad in her hands, and she looked tired from months of failed experiments and disappointing results. And she said the same thing happened again, and the gate showed no response to their electromagnetic tests or their gravity experiments or anything else they could think of. Trying. Jacob stared at the gate and felt something strange pulling at his mind like a half-remembered dream that kept slipping away whenever. He tried to focus on it, and the gate itself was 30 meters wide and made from some dark metal that should have rusted away millions of years ago, but instead looked as perfect as the day it was built, and symbols covered every inch of its surface, spiraling from the outer edge toward the center, where there was a shallow depression that looked like it might be important. The scientists had dated the gate to over 50 million years old, which meant it was built by the species everyone called the progenitors, and these legendary beings had supposedly seeded life across the galaxy before vanishing without any explanation. And now this gate was the first real proof that they had actually existed. At all, Kate scrolled through her notes and told Jacob that yesterday a different alien species called the Zafrani had tried using their psychic powers on the gate, and that did not work either. And last week the Korthax aliens used their molecular technology, and that also failed completely. And she said that Commander Lawrence was ready to give up and classify the gate as just a monument to a dead civilization. Jacob asked what kind of monument it would be, and Kate shrugged and said, "Maybe a gravestone," and they both looked down at the ancient structure sitting silent and dark in the pit below them. Dr. Alan Foster climbed out of the excavation looking exhausted, and his gray hair was messy with sweat, even though his environmental suit should have kept him cool, and he was the lead archaeologist for the entire expedition, and he had spent more time studying the gate than anyone else. Alan greeted them and asked if they had heard about the latest failure. And Jacob said yes, they had heard, and Alan made a frustrated sound and said the Galactic Council was getting impatient with the lack of progress and wanted to shut down the research station and use the money for other projects instead. But Alan insisted there was something important about the gate, and he could feel it in his bones, and he pointed at the symbols covering the surface and said they were too precise and too carefully arranged to be merely decorative, and he believed they were some kind of language or mathematical formula, or possibly both things at once. Kate asked if the translation teams had figured out what the symbols meant, and Alan said they had made some progress, and Dr. Linda Hayes thought she had identified number sequences and maybe coordinate systems, but without more context, they were basically just guessing at meanings. Alan wiped sweat from his face and told them that Earth Command wanted to pull their funding in 2 weeks and redirect everything to colony expansion projects, and that meant they only had 14 days left to make some kind of breakthrough, or the gate would be abandoned forever. Jacob felt something stir inside him at those words, and he made a sudden decision and said he wanted to examine the gate personally, and both Kate and Alan looked at him with surprise written all over their faces. Kate pointed out that 37 different alien species had already sent their best experts to study the gate, and she asked what Jacob could possibly find that all of them had missed. Jacob admitted he would probably find nothing at all, but he said everyone had been approaching the gate the same way, by bringing their technology and their assumptions and their complicated equipment, and maybe they needed to try something simpler instead. Alan asked what he meant by simpler, and Jacob said he meant just walking up to the gate and touching it with bare hands. And Alan looked interested and said that nobody had really tried extensive physical contact because most species were worried about contaminating the artifact or damaging it somehow. The Vorhalans could not maintain solid form long enough for prolonged touching, and the Korthax wore exoskeletons that prevented direct contact, and humans had taken samples and done scans, but nobody had simply placed their hand on the surface and waited to see what happened. Jacob started walking down the slope into the pit, and Kate hurried after him, asking if he should get authorization from the council first, because if something went wrong, it would be his responsibility, and Jacob said he knew that, and they only had 2 weeks left anyway. So what was the worst that could happen? He reached the bottom of the excavation, and the gate rose up in front of him, looking even more massive. From down here and up close, he could see that the symbols seemed to shift slightly when he was not looking directly at them, though they held perfectly still when he focused, and the metal surface had an odd quality, like it existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. Alan and Kate joined him, along with several other scientists who had noticed the human commander walking toward the gate, and a Zephrani observer with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on her head watched with polite curiosity. Alan told Jacob he could proceed whenever he was ready, and Jacob removed his right glove, feeling the cool thin air of Kepler 442b against his skin, and the atmosphere was breathable, but carried a faint metallic taste that made him think of old coins. Stepped forward until he stood directly in front of the central depression, and for a long moment he just looked at it, and somewhere deep in his mind he felt that strange familiarity again, as if he had done this before in a life he could not remember. Then, he reached out and placed his palm flat against the cold metal surface, and everything changed in an instant. Light exploded from beneath his hand, racing along the spiral symbols in waves of brilliant blue and white, and the entire gate began to vibrate with sudden power, and the vibration was so deep that Jacob felt it in his bones and in his teeth, and people around him gasped and shouted in a dozen different languages. Kate yelled for him to step back, but Jacob found he could not move, and his hand was not stuck or held by force, but he simply could not make himself pull away because it felt right to keep touching the gate, as if this was what he was meant to do. The symbols blazed brighter, and Jacob felt something reach into his mind, but not invading, just asking a question in a language that had no words, and the question was simple and profound at the same time. Who are you? And the answer came from somewhere deep inside Jacob, from a place he did not know existed until that exact moment, human and descendant of Earth and heir to the progenitors. The light reached the outer edge of the gate, and then rushed inward to the central depression, and reality twisted and bent, and the space inside the circular frame shimmered, like water disturbed by wind, and then with a sound like a great bell, the gate activated fully. Through the frame, Jacob could no longer see the far side of the pit, but instead saw a long corridor stretching away into impossible distance, and the corridor was lined with the same symbols, and at the far end something waited. Though he could not tell what it was, his hand came free, and he stumbled backward, and Alan caught him before he could fall, and all around them scientists stood frozen, in shock, staring at the active gate that had refused to work for 3 solid years until a human touched it. Kate was already speaking urgently into her communicator, telling the orbital station that something had happened, and the gate was active, and a human had somehow activated the gate when nobody else could. The Zephrani observer stepped closer, and her translator device rendered her words in English, and she asked why the gate responded to the human when it had refused all others. That question would echo across the galaxy in the hours and days that followed, and it would change everything. Humanity thought they knew about their place among the stars, but standing there in the orange light of an alien sun, watching reality ripple inside an ancient frame, Jacob had a different question burning in his mind. Where does it lead, and why did it choose him? And deep down in a place he was only beginning to understand, he knew the answer would change everything. The conference room aboard the CSS Endeavour felt heavy with tension, and Jacob sat at the long table surrounded by some of the most powerful beings in the entire galaxy, and through the circular viewport behind them, the planet Kepler 442b hung in space, looking peaceful, even though it had just changed everything. Everyone thought they understood about ancient history. Ambassador Threll of the Vorhallan Collective sat in the seat of honor, and his crystalline body caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the metal walls, and next to him sat High Researcher Ven of the Zephrani Consortium, and her 4 eyes stared at Jacob without blinking, and Commander Lawrence sat on his other side, and her face showed nothing but Jacob could tell she was worried. Ambassador Threll spoke first, and his voice sounded like wind chimes, and he said that Jacob had created quite an unusual situation. Jacob started to explain that he was only examining the artifact and had no way of knowing what would happen. But High Researcher Ven interrupted him sharply. She said that Jacob had succeeded where 17 different alien species had all failed, and an artifact built by the progenitors that had been silent for 50 million years suddenly woke up when a human touched it, and her tone made it clear she found this very suspicious. Jacob kept his voice calm and said that nobody actually knew if the progenitors built the gate, and that was just speculation based on the age and complexity. Threll said it was informed speculation because everything about the gate pointed to progenitor construction, including the sophisticated technology and the universal symbol system, and the fact that it was millions of years old. Commander Lawrence leaned forward and said this seemed like an academic argument, and what really mattered now was figuring out what the gate actually did, and how they should proceed. Safely, Ven said that safety was exactly what concerned them, because the progenitors had been incredibly powerful, and any technology they left behind could be equally dangerous. And yet this human had activated it with just a simple touch, which suggested a connection that nobody understood. Jacob felt many eyes watching him from all around the conference table, and there were representatives from the Korthax Dominion and the Silicate Commune and the Methane Collective and half a dozen other species, and all of them looked at him with mixtures of curiosity and suspicion and something that might have been jealousy. He surprised himself by speaking boldly and said he wanted to propose an investigation, and he volunteered to enter the gate with a small team, and they would document whatever they found and report back to the council. The room exploded with many voices speaking in many languages, and Threll raised one crystalline arm, and the noise died down. Ven said absolutely not, because they had no idea where the portal led, and it could be a trap or a test or a doorway to somewhere thousands of light years away, and sending people through would be extremely reckless. But Delegate Cross of the Korthax Dominion clicked his mandibles thoughtfully and said that someone had to go eventually, because the gate was open and had been open for 72 hours now, and either they investigated or they just stared at it. Forever Commander Lawrence agreed and said they had sent drones through, but all the drones lost their signals within 10 meters, and whatever existed on the other side interfered with remote technology. Jacob pressed his point and said this was why living investigators were necessary, and since he was the one who activated the gate, perhaps he was supposed to enter it. Ven demanded to know who he thought had designed this, and was he suggesting that the progenitors made the gate to respond specifically to humans, even though humans had evolved millions of years after the progenitors vanished? Jacob said he was not suggesting anything, and was just observing the facts, and the gate had not responded to any other species, but it responded to him, and maybe that meant something important. Threll pulsed with light in a way that Jacob had learned meant the ambassador was thinking deeply, and Threll said there were old theories about humans being genetically closer to the progenitors than other species, but most scientists dismissed these theories as fringe speculation. Ven scoffed and said that was ridiculous because humans were just a standard carbon-based evolution and nothing special about them. Jacob pointed out that they had activated the gate, though Ven said that proved nothing except that the gate sensors responded to human biochemistry for reasons nobody understood. Yet Dr. Alan Foster entered the conference room looking out of breath from hurrying, and he apologized for the interruption, but said he had new information that seemed very relevant. Threll gestured for him to continue. Alan brought up a holographic display showing the spiral symbols from the gate, and he said his team had been analyzing them more thoroughly since the activation, and Dr. Linda Hayes had made a breakthrough with the linguistic patterns. He explained that the symbols were not just decorative or instructional, but were actually a genetic sequence. Everyone in the room went silent. Commander Lawrence asked what species the genetic sequence belonged to. Alan said that was the interesting part because it was not specific to any one species but was a template that contained elements common to all carbon-based life in the galaxy. But certain markers were highlighted, and those markers corresponded most closely to human DNA. Ven said this was impossible. Alan admitted he had thought so too, but he had checked his analysis 17 times, and the gate was definitely keyed to recognize a specific genetic configuration, and humans were the closest match in the entire known galaxy. Delegate Cross leaned back and said, the implications were staggering because if the progenitors designed the gate to respond to specific genetics and humans matched that genetic pattern, then either humans were direct descendants of the progenitors, or the progenitors had designed Humans. Jacob finished the thought quietly and said, or the progenitors designed humans specifically. The room erupted again with even more emotion than before, because the idea that one species had been engineered by the legendary precursors while other species evolved naturally was inflammatory to say the least. Ven insisted this was all speculation built on speculation, and they were jumping to conclusions based on pattern matching and coincidence. Jacob said then let him prove it and let him take a team through the gate, and if there really was a connection between humans and the progenitors, they would find evidence on the other side. Threll asked what would happen if Jacob did not come back. Jacob said then at least they would know. The gate was dangerous and the council could seal it permanently. Commander Lawrence studied Jacob with an expression mixing pride and worry, and she said, if the council approved this, then Jacob would need a diverse team, and not just humans. Jacob agreed immediately and said they should include representatives from multiple species so they could determine if the other side responded differently to different biological signatures. Threll admitted this was a reasonable proposal, though he suspected very few people would volunteer to step through a portal to an unknown destination. But Kate Morgan stepped forward from where she had been standing near the back, and her jaw was set with determination, and she said she would go because Jacob was right that they needed to investigate and he should not go alone. Alan added his voice and said as the lead archaeologist he should be there to document any findings. A Vorhallan technician named Srel chimed his agreement, followed by a silicate researcher called Mara, and one by one volunteers stepped forward until Jacob had enough people for a full expedition team. Threll observed this with what might have been approval, and he said very well, and the council would deliberate and vote within the day, and Jacob should prepare his team because if approved, they would enter the gate tomorrow at dawn. The meeting ended, but as Jacob left the conference room, Ven intercepted him in the corridor, and her 4 eyes studied him with disturbing intensity. She said she wanted to give Jacob a warning, and if he truly was connected to the progenitors, and if there truly was something special about humans, then he might not like what he discovered on the other side. Jacob asked what she meant. Ven said the progenitors vanished for a reason, and every species in the galaxy had wondered why such an advanced civilization would simply disappear without explanation. And perhaps they did not disappear at all, and perhaps they were destroyed, and if humans were their descendants or their creations, then whatever destroyed the progenitors might still be waiting. She walked away, leaving Jacob alone with that disturbing thought. Back in his quarters, Jacob stared out at the stars and wondered if he was making a terrible mistake because the gate represented everything humanity had dreamed about, including contact with the legendary progenitors and answers to questions about their place in the cosmos, and proof that they were part of something greater. But Ven's warning echoed in his mind about what if the truth was darker than anyone imagined. His communicator chimed, and Commander Lawrence appeared on the screen. She said the council had voted, and Jacob was approved for the expedition, and then she told him that if the gate closed behind them and if they lost contact, then there might be no way to bring them back. And she asked if he was prepared for that possibility. Jacob thought about Earth and everything he would be leaving behind, and he thought about the mysteries that had haunted humanity since they first looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. He said yes. He was prepared. Lawrence said, then may whatever gods. Dawn painted the excavation site in shades of orange and gold, and Jacob stood at the edge of the pit, fully suited and equipped with his team of 6 volunteers gathered around him. And Kate Morgan checked her equipment one final time with her expression focused and intense, while Dr. Alan Foster clutched a specialized scanner designed to record whatever they encountered. Srel, the Vorhallan technician, vibrated with barely contained excitement, and his crystalline body caught the early light, while Mara from the Silica commune stood silent and still with her rocky exterior showing no emotion at all. The gate remained active just as it had been for 4 days now, with the portal surface rippling like disturbed water and showing glimpses of the long corridor that waited beyond. Commander Lawrence approached from the command tent, and her face looked serious, and she said final checks were complete and all telemetry was functioning, though they expected to lose signal once the team went inside, and each person carried a beacon that would activate if they returned to transmission range. Jacob said he understood. Lawrence handed him a small device and explained it was a deadman switch keyed to his vital signs. and if his heart stopped, it would trigger an emergency protocol and the gate would be sealed and no further exploration attempts would be authorized. Jacob attached it to his belt and said that was a cheerful thought. Lawrence said she needed him to understand the stakes, because he was not just representing Earth but representing everyone and everything they had built among the stars, and she told him not to do anything stupid. Jacob said he would try his best. Lawrence stepped back and Jacob turned to face his team, and they stood in a semicircle, and 6 individuals from different worlds were about to step into the unknown together. He said everyone knew the mission parameters and they would enter and explore for a maximum of 6 hours, and then return, and if anyone wanted to back out, now was the time. Nobody moved. Jacob said all right then, and they should stay close and watch each other's backs and remember, they were observers, not conquerors, and whatever they found inside they would document and record and not touch anything unless absolutely necessary. He took a deep breath and started down into the pit, and the others followed in single file. Up close the active gate thrummed with energy, and the symbols along its rim glowed with steady blue light, and the portal surface rippled constantly as if responding to invisible currents, and Jacob could feel heat radiating from it, and the heat was not uncomfortable, but it felt alive. Kate reported that sensors were reading spatial distortion within the frame, and whatever existed on the other side was not just another location but another space entirely. Jacob looked at each team member and asked if they were ready. Everyone nodded, he said. Then they should find some answers. Jacob stepped forward and entered the gate. The transition felt unlike anything he had ever experienced, and it was not teleportation or travel, but as if he suddenly existed in 2 places at the same time, and then reality made a choice about which one was real, and everything snapped into focus, and he stumbled slightly and caught himself against a smooth wall. He was inside the corridor. The others emerged behind him one by one, and each person reacted with varying degrees of disorientation. And Srel chimed, in distress, and his crystalline form flickered briefly, while Mara appeared unaffected and Alan bent over. Breathing hard, Jacob asked if everyone was okay. They all confirmed they were functioning, though some were shakier than others. The corridor stretched ahead of them, and it was impossibly long and perfectly straight, and the walls were made of the same dark metallic material as the gate itself, and covered in flowing symbols that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them, and the ceiling curved overhead with strips of soft light embedded in it that filled everything with pale blue illumination. Kate checked her equipment and said there was no signal back to the surface, and the beacon was recording but could not transmit, and they were completely on their own. Jacob said this was as expected, and he started forward, moving slowly, and every step took them farther from home. They walked for what felt like an hour, though time seemed strange in the corridor, and the symbols on the walls repeated in patterns that Alan tried to document with his scanner working continuously, and Srel kept running his crystalline appendages along the surface, analyzing the molecular structure. Srel murmured that the alloy should not exist because the bonding patterns were stable but impossible, according to known physics, and it was as if the atoms were being held in place by will rather than electromagnetic force. Mara observed that the progenitors were known for impossible engineering, and this merely confirmed their capabilities. The corridor finally opened into a chamber, and Jacob stopped so abruptly that Kate nearly collided with him. The space was enormous, and easily 100 meters across, and twice that high, and the walls curved upward into a dome covered entirely in more symbols, and in the center of the chamber stood a raised platform with 7 pedestals arranged around its edge, and each pedestal held a crystalline structure, pulsing with inner light, and in the very center of the platform, suspended in what appeared to be a stasis field, was a figure. Alan breathed an oath. The figure was humanoid, and roughly 2 meters tall, and dressed in material that shimmered like liquid metal, and its features were obscured by some kind of helmet or mask, but the body proportions were eerily familiar, and too familiar. Kate whispered that it looked human. Jacob approached slowly and climbed the steps to the platform, and up close, the figure was even more unsettling, and if you removed the advanced technology and the mysterious stasis field, the proportions could belong to any human, and the hands had 5 fingers, and the build was bipedal with bilateral symmetry, and forward-facing eyes visible through the transparent faceplate. He said this could not be coincidence, and he asked Alan if his scanner was recording everything. Alan said every second, and he pointed at the dome and said the symbols there were the same genetic sequences they found on the gate, but more complete. And this was a library or an archive or maybe a message trail moved to one of the pedestals studying the crystal it held. And he said each one corresponded to a different genetic template, and there were 7 variants, representing 7 potential evolutionary paths. Mara examined another pedestal and said this one contained sequences similar to silicate biology, and the chamber was showing them genetic blueprints for the major species groups in the galaxy. Kate said slowly that this meant the progenitors did not just seed random life, but designed them and designed all of them and created templates that would eventually evolve into every sentient species they knew. Jacob stared at the suspended figure and said if they designed all the species, then why did the gate only respond to humans, and why were humans special? A voice answered and said, perhaps they were not. Everyone spun around, and standing at the chamber entrance was another figure in the same kind of suit, but this one was moving and alive, and it raised its hands in a gesture of peace and reached up to remove its helmet. The face beneath was human and male and middle-aged with gray hair and eyes that held impossible depths of knowledge. The figure said his name was Marcus Webb, and he had been waiting 50,000 years for another human to find this place. The team stood frozen in shock, and Jacob's mind raced trying to process what he was hearing because 50,000 years was impossible, and humans had only reached space 500 years ago. Alan asked incredulously if Marcus was human. Marcus replied that he was, or he had been, though he was not sure what he was now, because the progenitors had changed him and extended his life, and given him a purpose, and he had been the guardian of this chamber, waiting for the day when their descendants would be ready to learn the truth. Jacob asked what truth. Marcus gestured to the suspended figure in the stasis field and said, that truth, because the progenitors were not aliens and they were human, and humanity did not evolve on Earth but seeded it along with templates for every other form of intelligent life. And then they forgot everything deliberately. The implications crashed over Jacob like a wave, and he said this was impossible, because the archaeological record on Earth went back millions of years. Marcus said with sadness that they made the record go back millions of years because they engineered their own regression and wiped their own memories and scattered themselves across the galaxy as primitive populations. And they did it to survive. Kate demanded to know what they were surviving. Marcus's expression darkened, and he said something had found them, and something from outside normal reality, and from beyond the dimensional barriers they thought were impenetrable. And they called it the hunger, and it consumed everything, including matter and energy and thought itself, and they fought for 10,000 years and lost. He said the only way to survive was to hide and to become so primitive that they would be invisible to the hunger. Jacob asked about the gate. Marcus explained it was a failsafe and it was keyed to human genetics, so only they could activate it when they had evolved back to technological capability. And this chamber contained all the knowledge they lost and all the technology they abandoned, and it was their inheritance waiting for them to reclaim it. Srel chimed urgently and asked if what Marcus said was true, and if the progenitors were human, then what about the other species like the Vorhalans and the Zephrani and the Korthax, and were they not real, but merely artificial crea? The chamber transformed before their eyes, and at Marcus's gesture the walls lit up with cascading displays of information, and holographic projections filled the air, showing star systems and equations and biological data and schematics for technology that made current galactic science look like primitive tools. Marcus explained that everything they saw was stored in quantum matrices embedded in the chamber walls, and the progenitors had mastered dimensional engineering and post-biological consciousness and fundamental reality manipulation, and they built gates that could fold space across galaxies and extended their lifespans indefinitely, and even learned to encode information directly into the quantum foam of space-time itself. Alan fumbled with his scanner, trying desperately to record everything, and he said this was beyond incredible, and this was proof of a technological level they did not think was possible. Marcus said it was possible because humanity had already done it, and their species knew it was possible deep in their genetic memory, and that was why humans had always been so driven to explore, and to build and to push boundaries. because it was not just curiosity, but remembrance, trying to surface. Kate studied a schematic that appeared to show some kind of weapon, and she asked if they had all this power. How could anything defeat them? And how could the hunger thing be so dangerous? Marcus's expression grew somber, and he waved his hand, and the displays shifted to show something else, and a darkness that was not quite darkness, and a void that seemed to consume light itself. And the image made Jacob's eyes water, as if his brain could not properly process what it was seeing. Marcus said, "The hunger was not from their universe, and it existed in the spaces between dimensions and in the gaps where reality broke down, and humans discovered it by accident when they were experimenting with interdimensional travel, and they opened a door, and it came through. The display showed cities and vast beautiful cities being consumed by the spreading darkness, and Jacob watched as structures that must have housed millions simply ceased to exist, and not destroyed but unmade, as if they had never been." Marcus continued and said it did not just kill but erased everything, and everything it touched was removed from causality itself, and the memories of those places and those people started to fade from everyone who survived. And that was why they had to forget, and not just hide, but genuinely forget their entire civilization, because as long as they remembered, and as long as they maintained their technology, the hunger could find them through the resonance of their own achievements. Srel vibrated with agitation, and asked how Marcus remained and how he remembered and why was he not found. Marcus explained that he was in stasis most of the time, and only waking periodically to check the gate's status, and this chamber was shielded by technology that made it dimensionally invisible, and as long as the gate remained inactive, the hunger could not sense it. But now the gate was broadcasting, and it would keep broadcasting until either they closed it or the hunger tracked the signal here. Jacob asked how long they had. Marcus said based on the distance the signal had propagated, and the hunger's last known search patterns, they had 2 weeks, and maybe 3. Kate asked if they could fight it, and with the technology stored here, and with knowledge of how to build these weapons, could they stop? The hunger, Marcus said that was the question they needed to answer, because the progenitors fought for 10,000 years and could not kill it. But maybe they were fighting wrong, and maybe they were trying to destroy something that could not be destroyed by conventional means. He brought up another display showing complex mathematical formulas, and he said in his long isolation, he had time to think. And the hunger existed in dimensional spaces they could not directly access, but what if they could seal those spaces and not fight the hunger directly, but close all the doors between its realm and theirs? Alan leaned forward and his eyes scanned the equations, and he said this would be a dimensional seal, and that would require manipulating the fundamental structure of space-time across the entire universe. Marcus said, not the entire universe, but just their local galactic cluster, and they could create a bubble of reality that was impermeable to interdimensional intrusion, and he pulled up more schematics and said the gate network could do it, because there were 17 gates scattered across this region of space, and all connected through quantum entanglement, and if they activated them all simultaneously and synchronize their output, they could generate a field strong enough to seal the boundaries. Jacob asked how many of these gates were currently active. Marcus said just this one, and the others were dormant and waiting for the right genetic key to wake them, and he looked directly at Jacob and said, that was where he came in, because only humans could activate the gates, and only humans carried the genetic markers that the security systems recognized, and Jacob would need to travel to each gate location and personally initiate the activation sequence. The weight of that statement settled over the group, and 17 gates across the galaxy, and each requiring human activation, and only 2 weeks to accomplish it all. Kate said flatly that this was impossible, because even with the fastest ships in the fleet, they could not reach 17 different systems in 2 weeks, and some of those coordinates Marcus was showing were months away at maximum speed. Marcus smiled and said they were thinking like someone who did not have access to progenitor technology. And the gates did not just connect places but were places, and once activated they formed a network, and someone could step through this gate and emerge at any other gate in the system instantaneously. Mara breathed the words portal technology and asked if they could travel across the galaxy in seconds. Marcus said once the gates were active, yes, but there was a problem, because to activate the first gate in a new system they would have to get there conventionally, and after that the network expanded and travel became faster and it was exponential growth, but it started slowly. Jacob studied the star map showing the gate locations and said they would need to be strategic and identify which gates were closest to each other geographically, and activate those first to create hub points, and then branch out from there. Marcus agreed and manipulated the display, highlighting a pattern of connections, and he said he had 50,000 years to calculate the optimal route, and if they followed this sequence and moved fast, they could activate all 17 gates in 14 days. Alan pointed out that this assumed nothing went wrong. Marcus agreed and said things would definitely go wrong because some of the gates were on hostile worlds, and some were in territory controlled by species that would not understand or accept what they were trying to do, and the hunger would be searching for them, and the moment they activated each new gate, they would be sending up a signal that announced their location. Jacob met the eyes of each team member, and he said this was bigger than their original mission, and bigger than just exploration, and if Marcus was right, they were talking about preventing an extinction-level threat, not just to humanity, but to all life in the galaxy. Srel insisted that the other species needed to know, and the council must be informed. Jacob agreed and said, but he was not sure they would believe them because he was not sure he completely believed all of this, and he was standing in the middle of it, and he turned to Marcus and asked if they could take proof, and something they could show the council that would convince them this was real. Marcus nodded and said he could provide data crystals with compressed archives of progenitor knowledge, and he could come with them, because seeing a 50,000-year-old human might help convince them. Kate asked if he would leave the chamber. Marcus said his vigil was over and the gate had been activated, and the knowledge passed on, and now he could finally finish what his generation started, and he moved to the central platform and touched a control, and the stasis field around the suspended figure flickered and died, and the figure slumped forward, and Jacob realized with a start that it was an empty suit and a memorial rather than a preserved body. Marcus said quietly that this was the last progenitor, and Director Sarah Chen, and she was the one who designed the regression protocol and who made the decision to forget, and she stayed active until the very end, making sure all the seed colonies were established and all the genetic templates were deployed, and then she came here to this chamber and entered permanent stasis as a testament to what they had sacrificed. He removed the helmet, reverently revealing a face preserved in perfect stillness, and she looked young and determined and infinitely sad. Marcus continued and said he had kept her company all these millennia, and talking to her and explaining his progress and sharing his loneliness. And now he got to tell her that it worked, and her plan worked, and humanity survived and evolved, and reached back out to the stars, and they got another chance. Jacob felt the weight of history pressing down on him, and he said they would not waste it. Marcus said good, and then they should return to Jacob's ship and convince the council that an ancient evil was about to wake up, and they needed to activate a network of dimensional gates to seal it away forever. And that should be an interesting conversation. Despite everything, Jacob found himself laughing, because what else could you do? When you learned your species used to rule the galaxy and now had to save it again, they gathered what they could carry, including data crystals and small artifacts, and Marcus's testimony. And the main conference room aboard the CSS Endeavour had never been more crowded, and Ambassador Threll's crystalline form occupied one entire corner, refracting light in agitated patterns, and High Researcher Ven stood rigidly with her 4 eyes fixed on Marcus with unconcealed suspicion, and Delegate Cross had deployed additional limbs in what Jacob recognized as a defensive posture, and in the center of it all, Marcus sat calmly explaining how he had watched civilizations rise and fall for 50,000 years while guarding the secrets of a humanity that had deliberately forgotten itself. Ven declared for the 3rd time that this was absurd, and they were being asked to believe that humans created all of them, and that they were not naturally evolved species but genetic constructs designed by ancient engineers. Marcus replied patiently that he was not asking her to believe anything, and he was telling her facts, and whether she accepted them was her choice. But the hunger did not care about her acceptance, and it would come. Regardless, Commander Lawrence studied the data crystals they had retrieved, and holographic readouts floated around her. And she said the technology described here was consistent with theoretical progenitor capabilities, and the genetic analyses supported his claims about species origins. Ven said sharply that it was convenient that humans turned out to be the master race and the progenitors of all life. Jacob interjected and said they were not a master race and they were refugees who wiped their own memories to hide from something that scared them so badly. They chose ignorance over extinction, and that was not superiority, but survival. Marcus added quietly that humans created the other species because they did not want to be alone in the universe and wanted companions and partners and equals who happened to share a common origin and wanted a galaxy full of diverse thinking beings. And that was humanity's greatest achievement and their last act before they regressed. Delegate Cross clicked his mandibles skeptically and asked why they should help activate the gates, and if they were keyed to human genetics, and if this was humanity's legacy, why not let them handle it alone? Jacob said because alone they would fail, and he explained that some gates were in Vorhallan space and some in the Silicate Commune, and some in territories controlled by species not represented here, and they would need to cross borders and request permissions and coordinate logistics across dozens of governments, and that would take months and they had days. Kate added that if the council endorsed the mission, and if they all agreed this was a galactic priority, then they could move freely and requisition the fastest ships and access secured systems and cut through bureaucracy. Ven observed that they were asking for unprecedented authority. Marcus countered that they were asking for survival, and his had already lasted 50,000 years too long, and he would like to finally rest knowing his vigil meant something. Something in his voice and in the exhaustion that no amount of time could erase seemed to reach the assembled delegates, and Jacob watched expressions shift from skepticism toward consideration. Thrill pulsed slowly, and asked if they did authorize this and if they designated this a council priority mission. What exactly would they need? Jacob brought up the star map Marcus had provided and said they needed fast ships capable of sustained high speed and diplomatic clearances for every major government and authorization to activate ancient technology on worlds they did not control, and most importantly, time. Because every hour they spent debating was an hour closer to catastrophe. Cross said they were asking the galactic community to gamble its stability on the word of one ancient human and the discovery of one active gate. Jacob replied that he was asking them to look at the evidence and make the logical choice, because everything they found supported Marcus's claims, including the gate's genetic keys and the chamber's contents, and the technology that matched theoretical progenitor capabilities. And at what point did healthy skepticism become willful ignorance? Lawrence straightened and said she had reviewed Jacob's mission logs and the archaeological data, and while extraordinary, the claims were supported by empirical evidence, and she was recommending Earth Fleet authorize full cooperation with a council-sanctioned expedition. One by one, other delegates added their cautious support, and not full belief perhaps, but acceptance that the threat was serious enough to warrant action, and within an hour the vote was called. The authorization passed by a narrow margin. Threll declared that they had their mandate and the council would provide resources and diplomatic support. But Jacob should understand that if they failed, and if the gates proved to be weapons or tools of control rather than salvation, the consequences for humanity would be severe. Jacob said he understood and they would not fail. Ven muttered that those were bold words for an impossible mission, but she did not object further. The conference dissolved into planning sessions, and Captain Lisa Rogers of the CSS Pathfinder volunteered her ship for the mission because it was one of the fastest vessels in the fleet, and Kate assembled a crew of specialists from multiple species, ensuring representation and expertise, and Alan coordinated with research teams to prepare portable scanning equipment, and Marcus shared everything he knew about the gates and their locations and their activation sequences and the network they would create. He explained that the first gate was in the Volos system and highlighted it on the star cluster and said it was on an uninhabited moon and easy to access, and once activated, it would link back to the Kepler gate, creating the first connection. In the network, Jacob asked what came after. Volos. Marcus said. Then, things got complicated because the nearest gates after that were in the Korthax Dominion and the Methane Nebula, and both would require negotiations. Lawrence noted that the Dominion owed Earth a favor from an earlier incident, and they could leverage that, but the Nebula Collective did not recognize Council authority. Jacob said simply that they would have to convince them. They departed within 12 hours, and the Pathfinder broke orbit with a crew of 27 individuals from 9 different species, and all committed to a mission that most of the galaxy thought was insane. Captain Rogers was a stern woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tightly, and she ran her ship with precision and expected excellence from everyone, but she also understood the stakes. She informed Jacob on the bridge that they would reach Volos in 3 days, and she had pushed the engines as far as they would go, without risk of catastrophic failure, and they would arrive with 12 days left on his timeline. Kate observed that this was cutting it close. Marcus said from where he stood studying a navigation display that everything about this mission was cutting it close because the hunger did not move quickly by interdimensional standards. But once it focused on a target, it was inexorable, and they would be racing against entropy itself. The journey to Volos was tense, and Jacob spent his time studying the progenitor data and learning about the civilization he had belonged to in a previous life he could not remember. And it was strange reading about their achievements and their culture and their art, because they had been explorers and scientists and philosophers and engineers, and they had built wonders and asked questions about the nature of reality itself, and they had found an answer that destroyed them. He asked Marcus one evening in the observation deck what they were like before they forgot. Marcus gazed out at the stars streaming past and said they were curious, and endlessly curious, and could not see a mystery without wanting to solve it, and could not find a boundary without wanting to cross it, and it made them great, but it also made them reckless. Jacob asked about the interdimensional experiments. Marcus said they thought they understood everything, and they had mapped the visible universe and mastered physics and extended their lives indefinitely, and were so confident in their knowledge that they did not consider there might be things in the cosmos they were not meant to find, and the hunger taught them humility, and then it tried to teach them extinction. Jacob asked quietly if Marcus thought they could actually stop it, and really stop it, and not just hide again. Marcus said he did not. No, but he knew that trying was better than waiting to be erased, and the species they created, and the diversity they seeded across the galaxy, deserved a chance to determine their own futures, and not as human creations but as equals who happened to share a common origin. The Pathfinder dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the Volos system right on schedule, and the moon where the gate was located appeared on the view screen, gray and cratered and unremarkable, except for the massive, circular structure visible from orbit. Lieutenant Gary Nelson from the science station reported that scans showed the gate was intact and dormant with no signs of recent activity or habitation, and they were clear to land. The away team assembled, and Jacob and Kate and Marcus and Alan and 4 security officers took a shuttle down to the surface landing near the gate in a plume of lunar dust. This gate was identical to the one on Kepler 442b, but seeing it in a new location made the scope of the network real, because there were 17 of these scattered across the galaxy, all waiting to be awakened. Marcus instructed that the procedure was the same, and Jacob should place his hand on the central depression, and the gate would recognize his genetic signature and activate. Jacob approached feeling the same strange sense of familiarity he had experienced before, as if he had done this 1,000 times in a life he see.